I am joined now by Professor Tafadzwa Mabhaudhi, who's the Professor of Climate Change at the University of Kwazulu-Natal, to speak to us on the impact of climate change. Prof, really a pleasure to have you despite the circumstances. Thank you for joining us today. Can you describe to us the specific impacts that climate change is having on South Africa, particularly in terms of increased flooding events like what we've seen recently?
Thank you very much. So climate change basically is intensifying weather systems and also increasing their frequency. So what we've been seeing, especially over the last 5 years, is an increase in flash floods, heavy rainfall events. We've also seen an increase in heat waves, high temperatures that we witnessed as well earlier this year, as well as seeing an increase in long dry spells also affecting agriculture. So in all instances, we're experiencing more extreme weather events. And right now we are dealing with floods, but also we are just coming out of a drought. So coming out of a drought, dealing with floods.
So the recent floods in Kwazulu-Natal and other parts of the country have had devastating effects, as what we heard in those previous packages. How have these floods highlighted the vulnerabilities in South Africa's infrastructure, but also our level of community preparedness?
So there are three things to always consider when we talk about climate risks and their impacts. The first one is understanding the hazard itself. So we understand what the hazards are: flash floods, temperatures. The hardest ones to deal with is vulnerability and exposure. Now, in South Africa, because of a high level of unemployed, poor people, and also existing inequality, it means we've got a high number of people who are vulnerable by that very nature. We also have a high number of people who are exposed, because a lot of these poor people then reside in areas that are unsuitable for human settlements, like you heard in the clip where people have built houses on wetlands. In KwaZulu-Natal, we have people who've built houses on open land, with poor foundation, poor infrastructure supporting those settlements. So then you've got people who are exposed by virtue of the poverty and where they are relative to where their hazards will occur, and also vulnerable by virtue of poverty and inequality that exists. So that combination then always translates into disasters, because when the hazard strikes, those people will be in harm's way and they are very incapable of then coping or responding to that hazard. And we've not really done well in terms of preparing ourselves, because we now know for certain that these events are going to be happening with increased frequency and intensity. But we've not taken strategic and systematic measures to address vulnerability and address exposure.
What are the immediate or even long-term health impacts of such flooding events on affected populations as well?
So some of the immediate impacts is you are definitely going to have a high risk of waterborne diseases, things such as cholera and so forth, because you've got a lot of water sitting around. You've got water that is polluted, that has moved in, and people accessing unsafe water for drinking. So that is an immediate health impact. With warming temperatures, we are also seeing the likelihood of mosquitoes being able to breed in new areas, meaning that the risk of malaria spreading into new areas increases. There's also the mental health effect, where studies that we have done at the university have shown that, repeated exposure to this sort of extremes, such as floods and droughts, increases depression and anxiety, because it's the same people who are affected repeatedly. So it's not just the human health as we understand it, there's also the mental health, which is more problematic and has longer-term implications.
Prof, in your own personal observations, how effective has the government and local organizations been in responding to these floods?
I think the response has been is there, but the response is inadequate, because the scale of the disasters or the scale of the hazards is always greater than the capacity to respond. So when these things happen, you almost always find out that the disaster management officials are stretched thin. They also don't have the resources to respond effectively. But that said, in practice, we should not be responding after things have happened, because by that time, people have lost their lives, people have lost their livelihoods. We should be investing more in terms of building our preparedness and proactive actions that actually reduce the risk of the disaster happening. We cannot stop the hazard from happening, but what we can mitigate is the impact it will have on people. And I think that's where authorities need to focus more investment on, because these things are going to keep happening. The same people are going to get affected because they've moved out now, but they'll move back again there, which means they'll still be in harm's way. So how do we prepare and how do we assist communities that are in harm's way to be prepared and not to be vulnerable so that we reduce the loss of life and livelihoods?
You make a critical point, Prof. In your opinion, what immediate actions should the South African government prioritize to really mitigate the impact of future floods?
So I think the first instance is around building public awareness, a major public awareness drive, especially because we know we've done the flood risk analysis, we've done the vulnerability mapping. So we know the areas that are at risk of flooding, and we know where there are communities who are living in those areas that are at risk. We need to educate those communities in terms of the risk. We need to develop protocols, clear communication protocols, because every time when this happens, the South African Weather Service usually issues a warning before, but that warning is not effectively communicated to the people who would be in the areas that are going to be affected. So there must be clear communication protocols that are community-based, so that the warning reaches the people. And there must be very clear protocols as how do you then respond when the warning gets to you. Do you move to safer higher ground? Do you evacuate? What do you take during the evacuation? Those are immediate steps in terms of increasing access to information through early warning systems. Longer steps, medium term, we need to look at how do we then strengthen the infrastructure. Both the ecological infrastructure, because these wetlands that people are living on are the very wetlands that are supposed to be buffering us from floods. But when we move into them, we damage them, and they can't play that buffering role. So how do we rehabilitate the environment so that it can play its buffering role? How do we also build infrastructure that can divert water away from where communities are, improve the drainage, improve stormwater drainage and things like that? That is medium term. Long term, it's also about human settlements and climate sensitive spatial planning. How do we grow our cities? Because we're urbanizing rapidly. People are moving into cities. How do we manage that? And how do we grow our cities in a way that is sustainable, in a way that balances the need for new accommodation and housing with the need to maintain and restore nature? So there are various actions, short term, medium term, and long term that the government needs to take. The fund that has been developed, the disaster fund, it needs to be clearly articulated in terms of how it is going to function and how communities can access it. And there has to be immediate responses to alleviate and support communities in instances like this.
Prof, very quickly as we wrap up, how can individuals and communities actually contribute to reducing their climate impact and increasing this resilience that you speak of to such natural disasters?
Very good question. So we can all play a role, each one of us. In our personal capacities, we have to be more mindful about how we interact with nature. Things such as building, homes and structures in wetlands, in low-lying areas or on steep slopes, because that is putting you at risk, that is putting you in harm's way. Also, individuals like you and me who are privileged, we have to be mindful about our contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. Do we carpool? Do we reduce the number of cars? How sensitive are we in terms of our carbon footprint? What can we do to stop or reduce our emissions? And also in the spaces that we live, are we growing trees? Are we cutting down trees? So it's just about being more conscious of the actions that we each take, and also understanding that small actions from individuals can add up to big action.
Professor Tafadzwa Mabhaudhi, it has been an insightful and enlightening discussion. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and perspectives on the impact of climate change and also floods in South Africa.